Have you ever pondered what it means to live a life of love, unity, and spiritual maturity? These are the profound themes that the Apostle Paul addresses in the first book of Corinthians. The book starts with Paul addressing the church in Corinth, a city known for its cultural diversity and moral complexity. Through the first chapter, Paul appeals to believers to find unity in their faith rather than division. The climax of this chapter is found in verse 10, where Paul urges the Corinthians to agree with one another and live in peace. The moral lesson, unity in diversity, is possible through faith. Moving to the second chapter, Paul continues to emphasize the importance of wisdom. However, it's not worldly wisdom he speaks of, but godly wisdom. The climax here is verse 14, where Paul explains that spiritual truths are discerned spiritually. The lesson, the wisdom of God surpasses human understanding. The third chapter is a call to spiritual maturity and growth. The climax here is in verse 7, where Paul reminds the Corinthians that God causes growth. The moral lesson, growth is a divine process that requires patience and trust in God. In the fourth chapter, Paul discusses the role of apostles, emphasizing their dedication and sacrifice. The climax is in verse 12, where Paul describes the apostles' hardships. The moral lesson? True commitment to faith may require sacrifice and hardship, but it is always worth it. The fifth and sixth chapters address immorality and lawsuits among believers. The climax of these chapters is the call to live lives of purity and to settle disputes among each other rather than in secular courts. The moral lesson? As believers, we are called to a higher standard and should strive for peace and purity in all our relationships. The 7th to the 10th chapters deal with various issues, including marriage, food sacrificed to idols, and the Lord's Supper. The climax is in chapter 10, verse 31, where Paul calls believers to do everything for the glory of God. The moral lesson: every aspect of our lives should reflect our faith and glorify God. The 11th to the 14th chapters talk about worship, spiritual gifts, and love. The climax is arguably in chapter 13, known as the Love chapter, verse 13, where Paul states that faith, hope, and love remain. But the greatest of these is love. The moral lesson? Love is the greatest virtue and should be the foundation of our lives. Finally, the 15th and 16th chapters discuss the resurrection of Christ and the collection for God's people. The climax is in chapter 15, verse 58, where Paul encourages believers to stand firm and always give themselves fully to the work of the Lord. The moral lesson? Our labor in the Lord is not in vain. In summary, the book of 1 Corinthians is a powerful exposition on love, unity, spiritual maturity, and living a life that glorifies God. It reminds us to seek godly wisdom, to trust in God's process of growth, to embrace sacrifice for the sake of faith, to uphold purity and peace, and above all, to love. It's a call to live lives that reflect our faith and devotion to God, assuring us that our labor in the Lord is not in vain. The book of 1 Corinthians, indeed, offers timeless wisdom for living a fulfilling and purposeful life.